Sure, I'm going to cover a couple of objections to the Kantian view of ethics. So remember, there are two principles that we looked at, the principle of universalizability and the principle of humanity. We'll start with the former. So the principle of universalizability says, always act in such a way that everyone could act as you are acting without contradiction. That's a slightly different way of putting it, but it captures that same essence of what universalizability is. So in the textbook, I raise a couple of different kind of counterexamples to the principle of universalizability, and I'm going to cover a couple of those right now. Consider Hitler at the end of World War II carrying out what has been called, what the Nazis themselves called the final solution. And consider this maxim that Hitler, and the Nazis put forward. We will carry out the final solution in order to create a pure Aryan nation. So again, what do we mean by an Aryan nation? Well, something like all people considered to be white by the Nazis' definition. So run this through the principle of universalizability, and then you ask yourself, suppose everybody were acting on that maxim, would the goal be achievable? Right? What's the goal here? Well, creating a pure Aryan nation. Right? So suppose that everyone were carrying out a final solution in order to achieve that end. Could it be achieved? And it seems like clearly the answer here is yes, it could be. And yet, obviously, that seems like the most paradigmatic kind of genocide is one of the most paradigmatic, morally wrong things we can think of. And yet, this maxim seems to pass the test. Again, what does that show? Well, it shows that there's something wrong with the test, right? Or consider a character like Joker from the series, from the Batman series. And suppose that, Joker's maxim is this: I will punch random strangers in the face in order to increase chaos and suffering in the world. All right, now let's imagine that that's not just Joker's maxim, which seems like the kind of thing Joker would do, but let's run that through the principle of universalizability, right? So imagine everybody's acting on that maxim. Would the goal be achievable? What's the goal? Well, increase chaos and suffering in the world. Well, if everyone was punching each other in the face, it seems like by definition that increases the chaos and suffering of the world. So there's two examples of the ways that the principle of universalizability misfires, right? Because it seems like neither of these things should be morally permissible, and yet they seem to pass the test of universalizability, at least in the way that we've defined it, in that very strict sense of, would it be possible for everyone to carry out that same maxim logically possible, right? Can we imagine a scenario where that takes place? And we can, right? Again, the goal is achievable in either case if the action is universalized. The principle of humanity, just to recall, says to always treat rational beings as ends in themselves, never as a mere means. So we're going to raise three different types of problems for the principle of humanity. One is the problem of vagueness. Two is the problem of moral luck. And three is the problem that it seems like the principle is too restrictive of which beings have moral status, right? Again, moral status just is this idea that, if a being has moral status, it means that its interests matter morally, that you have to take those interests into account in deciding what to do, right? So, we don't think that rocks have moral status. We can do with them what we will. Or grass, we can do with it what we will. But we do think that, human beings have moral status. And I think most people think that animals have moral status. So we're going to raise these three different problems in turn, starting with the problem of vagueness. So in the textbook, I talk about a couple of different examples. So suppose we consider, on the bottom right picture there like the paparazzi taking photos of celebrities, and then of course consumers like ourselves buying tabloids, or basically engaging with that content that paparazzi are creating. In doing that, are we treating celebrities as a mere means, right? And the point here, the point about vagueness, is that it's kind of unclear. So, is it the case that celebrities, just in being celebrities, have kind of signed on to, implicitly or explicitly signed on to this idea that because I'm now a celebrity, I accept that, people are going to take photos of me, or, is it more like, no, they didn't sign up for this, and, we are treating them as a means to our own ends, whatever those ends are, right? Our kind of insatiable interest in celebrities, even if they don't, want to be, photographed all the time, and, I mean, obviously, in some cases, they know they will be, but, like, suppose they're in their house, right? There's a documentary about former Prince and Prince. Oh, I'm forgetting his name, but there's a documentary. Harry and Meghan. And I'm sure all can come up with lots of examples of kind of invasive paparazzi. The point there, again, is just that it's unclear whether we are using celebrities in that whole ecosystem, right? Are we using celebrities as a mere means or not? Another example is consider people in a famine or some other sort of disaster where, they have no food, shelter, etc. And consider ourselves in, as we are, not in that situation, who have extra money to spend on things. If we choose not to spend money, donate money to these famine victims, and instead choose to buy some luxury item that we don't need, are we in doing that? Are we using them as a mere means or not? Right? And again, the question here is it's unclear. So the whole objection is it's unclear. There are cases where it's unclear whether or not we are treating rational beings as a mere means or as ends, right? And that's the problem. It's just unclear how you apply the principle of humanity to cases like this, because it's unclear whether our actions are indeed treating individuals as a mere means. Consider now what philosophers call moral luck. Now, one of the things going on here is that the Kantian view of agency, of moral agency, really has a strong, extreme kind of view of moral responsibility. So it says that if you are a rational agent, then you are totally in control of your action and should be held responsible in any case where you're acting as an agent. And the problem of moral luck raises this issue that, well, maybe we're less autonomous, maybe we're less in control of things than the Kantian thinks we are. So consider this example. We'll consider two different people, Bob and Henry. Bob leaves the bar extremely intoxicated and drives home. He unknowingly runs several red lights, drives on the sidewalk a couple of times as well. Luckily, no one is harmed because no one happens to be in harm's way as Bob drives home. Henry, in contrast, leaves the bar in exactly the same way, same level of intoxication, drives home in exactly the same way that Bob did, right? However, Henry, in driving home in that way, just happens to hit and kill a pedestrian. Now, if you consider the difference between what Bob and Henry did, just even legally, Henry's going to be in a lot more trouble. And I think a lot of people would also have this intuition that Henry has done something, much worse, right? But what's the difference in their actions? Well, really nothing. It's just the difference is in the consequence, right? It seems like Henry was just really unlucky that there happened to be a pedestrian out while he was driving home. And Bob was just lucky, right? And so the difference in the way that we judge Bob and Henry seems to come down to nothing to do with their actions. Their actions were the same, but in the results. But those results were nothing that either one of them had any control over, right? So if we think that moral luck is a real feature of morality, then the objection here is that the Kantian ethical view, because it has such a strict view of moral responsibility, it can't account for things like moral luck. It can't account for the way that we judge Henry more harshly than Bob. The Kantian view would have us judge them both the same, because their actions were the same, right? They were both equally responsible. But it's insofar as it seems like there is a difference between Henry and Bob. One committed murder and one didn't. I mean, Bob could have. It was just lucky that he didn't, right? So no one's saying here that Bob didn't do anything wrong. What we're saying is that it feels like Henry's action, because it resulted in murder, what do they call it? Third-degree murder, manslaughter. Henry's action, resulted in manslaughter, and Bob's didn't. We seem to think that Henry is kind of more guilty morally, right? And the Kantian is unable to account for that. Finally, let's consider this issue of who has moral status on the Kantian view. Again, remember, the principle of humanity is talking about rational beings. We have a moral duty to treat rational beings as ends in themselves. But what about beings that are not rational beings? Do we have a moral duty to treat them as ends in themselves? Well, consider what Kant says. Here's Kant's own words. If a man shoots his dog because the animal is no longer capable of service, he does not fail in his duty to the dog, for the dog cannot judge, but his act is inhuman and damages in himself that humanity which it is his duty to show towards mankind. If he is not to stifle his human feelings, he must practice kindness towards animals, for he who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with men. Think about what Kant is saying here, right? Kant is saying that there's nothing kind of inherently wrong with killing the dog. Rather, what's wrong with it, possibly, is that insofar as one kind of fosters these kinds of actions or feelings towards, non-rational creatures like dogs, it might bleed over into the way one treats rational beings like humans, right? And so the idea is that, there's nothing in and of itself wrong with treating an animal, a non-human animal, as a mere means, right? But Kant's saying we have to kind of watch out how we do that because of how that could bleed over into the way that we treat rational beings. So, on the Kantian view, who has moral status? Which beings have moral status? Well, only rational beings, only beings that can guide their actions in accordance with their own kind of ends, right? That can, so to speak, act for reasons that are different than instinct, that are different than the kinds of reasons that, natural selection kind of puts inside of us. Humans, for example, can decide not to reproduce, right? That is very counter to what natural selection would have us do, but we can decide to do that for our own reasons. And again, that is what it means for a being to be a rational being, right? And which of these beings have that capacity, right? Which of these beings have moral status on the Kantian view? Well, not dogs or any other non-human animals. Interestingly, not human infants either yet. They're not rational beings yet, right? Only kind of normally developed human beings would be rational beings for Kant. And so only such beings would have moral status. The objection here, of course, is that it seems like these other beings should have moral status as well. That is, it seems that, we have a moral obligation to act in certain ways towards those beings, even if they're not rational, right? And that seems to be, for many, a really big hole, something missing in Kant's theory.